The twin suns of Serene 4 burned like molten coins above the horizon, their heat pressing down with a cruelty that seemed almost sentient. The air shimmered over dunes the color of bone dust, and every step left a print that vanished in moments, swallowed by the shifting winds. The Galactic Academy had chosen this planet precisely for its hostility. The survival exam was designed to strip cadets of comfort, technology, and certainty, to see what remained when all tools were taken away. The rule that terrified everyone most was simple: no fire, no open flame, no chemical ignition, no plasma or artificial heat exceeding 80 degrees. It sounded theoretical at first, something to be managed through ingenuity, until the first sun rose and reality cracked open. Within hours, metallic canisters warped, sealed food capsules expanded and burst, and rations spoiled in the heat. Alien cadets of every imaginable species gathered around the briefing shelter, their forms trembling in the glare. The insectoid Crix rubbed his segmented forearms together, releasing a nervous clicking sound. The serpentine Thalri coiled under the shade of a rock ledge, her scales dulling from dehydration. Even the avian Nithari, who had prided herself on endurance, panted and kept her wings half spread to reflect light. Every instinct screamed for water, for shadow, for something cooler than this merciless sky. Elias Rowan stood apart from the crowd. His academy-issued uniform was rolled up to his elbows, the sleeves darkened by sweat, his skin reddened but steady. The others had begun rationing their nutrient gels, complaining about the prohibition against fire, but Elias looked out across the dunes and said nothing. His mind was turning in slow, deliberate gears. He had grown up in the deserts of Arizona, where his father had once shown him how to fry an egg on a rock just to prove a point about the sun. That memory flickered like a candle flame in his thoughts, small but stubborn. He squatted down, pressed his palm into the sand, and hissed as the heat bit into his skin. There was power here. Too much power, maybe, but power all the same. The first day broke half the class. The reptilian students from colder worlds developed heat sickness by midday. The moisture-based creatures began to desiccate, their protective gels evaporating into the air. Some tried to dig burrows, but the sand collapsed before they could form anything stable. Others attempted to build makeshift shelters from reflective foil, but the constant gusts shredded the fragile material. The camp quickly descended into frustration and blame. Shouting echoed across the dunes, alien tongues snapping at each other in a dozen dialects. But through it all, Elias remained quiet, watching, learning the rhythm of the environment. He noticed how the dunes shifted at a predictable angle, how the sun rose higher on one side and cast shorter shadows as the hours passed, how the ground beneath certain patches of clay retained a faint coolness beneath the scorching surface. He crouched low, ran his fingers through the sand, and tasted the dust. It was rich in silicates, something that could harden under prolonged heat. By nightfall, the temperature plummeted. Serene 4's twin suns sank behind the horizon, and with them went the illusion of endless heat. The wind turned knife-cold, howling across the plain like a thing unchained. The cadets huddled together for warmth, their morale fracturing. Food supplies were technically plentiful, but the problem wasn't quantity. It was the impossibility of preparation. Most of the rations required heating to neutralize toxins or unlock their nutrient compounds. Without fire, even eating became dangerous. One of the aquatic Venari cadets attempted to digest unheated protein paste and collapsed within minutes, her biochemistry overwhelmed by uncooked enzymes. Panic followed. The night became a chorus of arguments and despair. Elias lay awake under a sliver of torn thermal blanket, staring up at the twin moons. He could hear the whispers, some calling him foolish for not joining the others in their desperate debates, others mocking his silence as ignorance. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He remembered an old field manual from his early training, a section about desert nomads who cooked bread beneath the sand, using nothing but the day's accumulated heat. He remembered his mother's pottery classes, how clay hardened when left long enough in direct sunlight. Every piece of knowledge he had gathered through his life, mundane, human, and grounded, was reshaping itself into a survival plan. At dawn, he began testing. While others waited for another briefing, Elias walked out beyond the perimeter, dragging behind him a scrap of torn tarp and a few containers. He knelt by a dried riverbed, where faint cracks revealed pockets of clay beneath the sand. It was soft and sticky when mixed with the small amount of water he carried. He molded it into rough bowls, thick at the base and hollow at the center, and set them in a half circle to face the rising suns. The others glanced at him as though he had lost his mind. "The human is sculpting toys," one of the crystalline Aelari whispered. Elias ignored the laughter. He had no intention of explaining until he had proof. By midday, the clay had hardened to a pale orange. Elias tapped one of the domes and smiled at the hollow sound it made. The surface was hot enough to blister skin, far beyond the warmth of a normal rock. He crushed a handful of wild grains the Academy had scattered as part of the foraging challenge, mixed them with water into a dough, and placed the lump inside one of the clay hollows. Then he sealed the opening with a flat slab of clay and waited. He didn't watch the time. He watched the shadows. When the shade shifted from one dune crest to another, roughly an hour later, he lifted the lid. The smell hit first, faint, nutty, unmistakably cooked. Steam curled from the bread's surface as he broke it open. It was crude, uneven, but edible. The taste was bland, yet the psychological impact was profound. He had made warmth from sunlight and earth alone. No combustion, no rule broken, only redefined. By evening, word of his success spread across the camp. Some cadets approached him quietly, pretending not to be curious. The Thalri female who had mocked him earlier now lingered nearby, pretending to adjust her water ration while eyeing the small dome. Elias didn't gloat. He simply built another one, explaining nothing. When the second batch of food came out, a handful of cadets offered their leftover rations to trade. He refused the trade, but accepted the company. If he had learned anything from humans throughout history, it was that survival was a communal art, not a solitary one. That night, when the cold wind returned, the camp's mood had shifted. Some cadets began shaping their own crude clay ovens, imitating his method with varied success. Elias walked among them, adjusting the thickness of their walls, showing where the angle of the suns would strike best in the morning. He didn't speak much, only enough to guide their hands. What had begun as mockery turned to quiet imitation, and imitation to respect. As the first rays of dawn crawled over the horizon, the camp no longer looked like a group of stranded cadets, but like the beginning of a settlement. Small clay domes dotted the sand like seeds taking root in the desert. The air filled with the faint smell of grain and baked roots, soft and comforting. The instructors who observed from orbit noted the change in behavior and logged it without comment. The experiment had begun, and already one species, one singular human, was rewriting the purpose of the test. Elias stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the suns climb higher, his shadow stretching long and thin across the dunes. The planet was still deadly, the rules still absolute, but he had found a loophole hidden in plain sight. Fire could be forbidden, but heat could never be contained. What mattered was not the flame itself, but the will to create transformation. For the first time since the exam began, he smiled. The desert no longer looked empty. It looked full of potential. The next dawn came blazing and white, and the dunes shimmered as though the planet itself were breathing heat. The camp was quieter than before. No more shouting, no more arguments about who had the better survival theory. The night had been cold, but it was not unbearable now that the cadets had eaten. The few pieces of bread Elias had baked were passed around like relics of hope, each bite breaking the unspoken despair that had ruled the camp for days. What began as skepticism was turning into curiosity, though no one yet dared to say it aloud. Elias could feel the shift as clearly as the warmth under his feet. He had shown that survival was not only possible, it could be built, shaped, and multiplied by human hands. Elias rose before the others, as he often did. The horizon was still silver with dawn, the air still cool enough to breathe deeply without pain. He walked toward the dried riverbed, where he had left the first clay ovens. Their surfaces had hardened further overnight, glinting faintly under the growing light. He knelt beside one, brushing sand from the curved walls, and noticed how the cracks had formed along the top. The heat of the day and the cold of the night had made the clay expand and contract, leaving thin veins like scars across the surface. But the structure still held. It had endured the planet's wrath, and that was enough to make him think of refinement, not failure. He began to collect more clay before the others stirred, carrying it in a cut section of a broken ration crate. The texture changed depending on the depth, drier near the surface, slick and heavy below. He dug until his knuckles bled, then mixed the lumps with what little water he had left, kneading it into a smoother consistency. His hands, covered in dust, looked older than his 21 years, but he did not care. The act of shaping clay into form gave him purpose, a rhythm that felt human in a place designed to strip humanity away. By the time the first cadets began to emerge from their shelters, Elias had already molded 3 new ovens. These were larger, more rounded, and had small vents carved along the top to allow air circulation. He shaped shallow depressions around their bases to collect sunlight reflected from the sand, turning the ground itself into a secondary heat source. It was a slow, meditative process. He pressed his palms against each curve, feeling the temperature, adjusting thickness by instinct. When he finally stepped back, his forearms were streaked with dried clay, his breath slow and steady. The avian Nethari, whose feathers shimmered pale blue, approached cautiously. She stood at a distance at first, folding her wings close, as though afraid to disturb him. "You think this will last?" she asked, her voice sharp and precise. Elias looked up at her and smiled faintly. "Not forever, but long enough to matter." She tilted her head, studying his work, as if trying to decode something alien. "Your kind builds things from dirt. Most species here see that as regression." He nodded, still kneeling beside the ovens. "Maybe, but sometimes the past holds what the future forgot." She didn't answer, but remained there longer than she intended, her curiosity outweighing pride. When the suns reached their peak, the temperature became unbearable. The cadets retreated to their shelters, but Elias continued to work. He broke pieces of shattered metal plating from a transport crate and angled them beside the ovens, testing how the reflected light concentrated. When he adjusted the plates just right, the temperature inside the dome soared. It was hot enough to boil water. He grinned, wiping the sweat from his brow, and set a small pot made from layered clay at the oven's heart. Inside it, he placed crushed roots mixed with ground grains, the closest thing to a stew he could make in this wasteland. The smell was faint, but distinct. When the steam began to rise from the clay's cracks, the scent of roasted earth and cooked starch drifted into the air. The alien cadets stirred from their tents. First the Iryx, with his translucent carapace, came crawling on all fours, antennae twitching. Then the Thalri slithered forward, her eyes narrowing at the sight. Even the crystalline Elari, who claimed not to need food, stood near enough to feel the heat radiate against his mineralized skin. No one said anything. They only watched as Elias lifted the clay lid with a strip of folded fabric, releasing a burst of steam. Inside, the mixture had thickened and darkened, bubbles glistening at the surface. It was primitive and imperfect, but it was nourishment. He didn't eat first. He ladled portions into fragments of metal plating and handed them out wordlessly. One by one, the cadets took the food. The Iryx hissed softly in approval. The Thalri blinked twice, a gesture of respect in her culture, and the Nethari closed her eyes as she swallowed, murmuring something under her breath that sounded like gratitude. Elias finally sat down, leaning against the oven, and watched them. It was not pride he felt, but calm, the kind of calm that came from seeing potential replace fear. As evening approached, Elias turned his focus to experimentation. He realized that the clay domes could store heat long after sunset if built thicker at the base and sealed properly. He began mixing sand and broken rock into the clay to make it denser, shaping a new series of ovens half buried into the ground. He positioned them near the reflective plates, carefully aligning everything according to the sun's shifting angle. His mind worked like an engineer's and an artist's combined, calculating temperature retention, airflow, and energy dispersion. He had no tools for measurement, only observation and instinct honed through necessity. When the first of his improved ovens hardened, he decided to test its endurance. He placed inside a few small pebbles soaked in water to simulate the pressure of cooking food. Then he sealed the dome and waited for the night's cold to fall. Hours later, when the rest of the camp slept, he returned. The oven was still warm, faintly glowing red in the moonlight. The heat it had captured during the day was bleeding back into the air, soft and steady, like the breath of a living creature. He crouched beside it and placed his hands near the vent. The warmth was comforting, almost human in its persistence. He whispered under his breath, "You'll do." The following day, the camp changed rhythm entirely. The cadets began helping one another build more ovens, though most lacked the finesse of Elias's work. The air filled with the sounds of digging, molding, and quiet concentration. For the first time since the exam began, the camp functioned as something close to a community. The instructors orbiting above could see the geometric patterns forming in the sand, circles of clay domes, paths between them, and reflective plates glinting like tiny mirrors of civilization. Elias watched as the Thalri coordinated water gathering while the Irix managed distribution. Even the haughty Aelari contributed by splitting crystal fragments to use as additional reflectors. The human had not only fed them, he had given them purpose. By late afternoon, Elias began building what he called a double-shell oven. He envisioned it as a layered chamber, an inner cooking zone, and an outer wall to trap heat longer. It took him hours to mold the structure correctly, adjusting thickness with precision, smoothing cracks with wet clay, and reinforcing the base with compacted sand. He left a single slit near the top to function as both a vent and a window for sunlight. When it dried, it resembled a small hut more than an oven. Some cadets joked that he was building a shrine, but Elias only smiled and said, "In a way, I am. A shrine to patience." When the sun began to sink, he placed another batch of dough inside the new oven. This time, he mixed crushed seeds into the paste, hoping for texture. As night fell and the temperature dropped sharply, he waited beside it, wrapped in his thin blanket. When he opened the oven hours later, the bread inside was golden, crisp, and warm to the touch. He tore it open, steam curling upward like a sigh. It wasn't perfect, still uneven, still too dense, but it was progress. He knew he could refine it further. That night, as others slept, Elias sat beside his ovens, staring at the glowing horizon. The wind carried the smell of baked clay and faint smoke from minerals that had overreacted to heat. It reminded him of home, not in sight, but in spirit. The desert no longer felt like punishment. It was a canvas, and he had begun painting it with survival. The exam had started as a test against nature, but for Elias it was becoming a dialogue with it. Each grain of sand, each shard of clay, spoke a language he was beginning to understand. When the twin suns rose again, the camp was no longer silent. Laughter echoed among the dunes. The cadets shared tasks without orders, trading food, swapping ideas, improving designs. Elias didn't claim leadership, yet every decision seemed to orbit around him naturally. He was no longer just another participant. He was the pulse keeping the camp alive. In a world where fire was forbidden, he had taught them that heat lived in more than flame. It lived in cooperation, adaptation, and the quiet determination of a single human mind refusing to give up. The days that followed transformed the barren camp into something almost unrecognizable. The dunes that had once been silent and deadly now shimmered with motion and purpose. Under the relentless twin suns, dozens of clay domes baked in perfect alignment, their curved surfaces gleaming with trapped heat. The scent of baked roots, grains, and resin filled the air, replacing the acrid stench of fear that had once defined the place. What had begun as one man's desperate experiment had become a collective rhythm, a system that pulsed like a living organism. Elias had not asked to lead, but the others had begun to follow him naturally, drawn to the quiet certainty in his movements. He started his mornings before the rest, his silhouette a solitary line against the sunrise. He checked every oven with the precision of a craftsman, tapping walls for weakness, inspecting vents for cracks, and testing internal temperatures by hovering his hand above the openings. The sound of his steady breath mingled with the low hum of life returning to the camp. When he finished his inspection, he knelt beside the large reflective structure that the Nethari had helped him build. A frame of polished crystal shards set in the sand like a giant sunflower turned toward the light. It was primitive, yet beautiful, and it worked. The structure concentrated the sun's rays with surprising efficiency, heating a central clay platform that reached searing temperatures within an hour of dawn. It had become the heart of the camp, a place everyone called the Sun Kitchen. Elias never liked the name, but it fit. Around it, the cadets gathered each morning, bringing foraged ingredients, dried roots from the shaded ridges, seeds from hardy vines that crept between rocks, mineral dust collected by the Elari that acted as seasoning, and even the gelatinous water sacks found beneath the dunes. The food that came from these ingredients was no longer just sustenance. It was invention. He watched with silent pride as alien hands and claws began to create their own variations of dishes, combining what they had learned from him with the instincts of their species. The thalri roasted insect larvae wrapped in clay sheets. The irex boiled algae paste into translucent blocks. The nathari mixed powdered grain with liquid from crushed cacti to make a sort of sweet bread that hardened under the sun's glare. The desert, which had once threatened to kill them all, was now feeding them. Elias spent the third week experimenting with a new idea. He wanted to harness both suns at once, merging their heat into a single focal point. Using shards from the broken transport crates and slivers of polished crystal, he built a curved half-dome that acted as a giant reflector. He positioned it above one of his larger ovens, using sandbags made from ration fabric to hold it steady. The work was dangerous. The concentrated sunlight could blind anyone who looked directly at it, and the heat radiating from the structure was strong enough to scorch skin instantly. But Elias had learned to respect danger as an old friend, something that always demanded attention but rewarded understanding. He worked tirelessly through the day, sweat running down his neck, his skin blistering beneath the light. By evening, when the second sun began to dip below the horizon, he stepped back and examined his creation. The new oven glowed faintly orange even after sunset. He placed inside it a clay pot filled with soaked grains and sealed it shut. The others watched in silence, uncertain what to expect. By morning, when he cracked it open, the grains had swelled and softened into something almost like porridge. It was rich, filling, and completely cooked without flame. The cadets erupted in a cheer that startled the dunes into echoing the sound. From that day forward, the Sun Kitchen became more than a tool. It became a symbol. Every species contributed something to its expansion. The Elari added reflective fragments to increase efficiency. The Thalri wove reed mats to filter sand from the air currents. The Irex built tiny wind tunnels beneath the ovens to control airflow. Elias guided them but never commanded. He preferred to teach through example, showing how small details shaped results. He explained that heat was not chaos, it was direction, a force that could be managed with care. Some of the cadets began calling him the Heat Walker, a name that made him smile only when he was alone. In the evenings, when the light softened and shadows grew long, Elias often sat near the largest oven and wrote on pieces of flat clay. He etched diagrams with a sharpened bone, mapping airflow, temperature gradients, and angles of light. The Thalri female, her name was Serene, sometimes sat beside him, asking quiet questions. She was curious not only about his methods, but about his reasoning. "Why do you build as if you'll stay here?" she asked one evening as the wind died down. Elias looked at the horizon, where the suns burned faintly through a layer of dust. "Because building is what keeps me human," he answered softly. "If I stop creating, I start waiting to die. That's not what I came here for." She said nothing more, but her gaze lingered on him longer than before. Weeks passed, and the camp flourished. What had once been a temporary survival site now resembled a village. The cadets had built storage pits lined with clay to preserve dried food. They constructed shaded communal areas from woven reeds and clay-coated cloth, places where they gathered to eat and exchange ideas. Even the most cynical among them began to understand what Elias had always known, that survival was not about enduring hardship, but about transforming it into stability. The human instinct to build, to adapt, to make something functional out of chaos was contagious. But as with all growth, the desert began to push back. The twin suns grew hotter, their orbits aligning in a rare phenomenon that intensified the heat by nearly 30%. The surface sand turned to glass in some places, cracking under the strain. The reflective crystals that once helped focus sunlight now risked overheating the ovens. One afternoon, as Elias tested the large reflector dome, a sudden gust of wind shifted its angle. The concentrated light beam ignited a burst of air, and the structure cracked with a sound like shattering ice. Elias threw himself aside as molten fragments sprayed across the sand, burning holes through his sleeve. The camp rushed toward him, their faces filled with alarm. He waved them off, his arm bleeding but his voice steady. "It's just heat being heat," he said. "Nothing misbehaves when you expect its nature." He laughed quietly, though the pain made him wince. That incident became a lesson for everyone. Elias rebuilt the reflector with the help of the Aelari. this time incorporating cooling gaps and angled flaps to diffuse excessive light. He taught the others that balance was the true secret to mastery. Too little heat and nothing changes, he explained. Too much and everything breaks. Survival is not about control, it's about conversation. His words stayed with the cadets long after, repeated among themselves like fragments of an ancient proverb. The following day, a storm gathered on the horizon. The wind rose, sweeping through the dunes with a sound like distant thunder. The cadets moved quickly, reinforcing their ovens and shelters, securing the reflectors with ropes made of twisted fiber. Elias watched the sky darken, his instincts alert but calm. He had learned that storms on Serene 4 rarely came without warning. The twin suns bled orange light through the swirling dust, and the camp fell into an eerie twilight. When the storm hit, it came not as rain, but as a wave of fine, burning sand. The air shimmered, the ground vibrated, and the heat surged like the breath of a furnace. Elias ordered everyone to stay low, covering vents and sealing the ovens. The wind howled for hours, erasing the outlines of everything. But when it passed, and silence returned, the camp still stood. The ovens had endured, protected by their own design, half-buried, heat-tempered, and perfectly shaped to deflect force. The cadets emerged one by one, their eyes wide in disbelief. Elias simply nodded and said, "See, the desert doesn't want to destroy. It wants to test what deserves to remain." That night, under the cooling moons, the camp gathered for a shared meal. The ovens glowed faintly, radiating the warmth stored during the storm. Elias sat among them, silent but content, his hands raw and covered in clay. He listened to the soft laughter, the hum of alien voices speaking in languages that had once clashed, but now mingled in peace. He realized then that the exam had already changed. It was no longer about survival or competition. It had become a study in creation, a testament to what happened when limits were seen not as barriers, but as invitations. When the instructor's ship passed overhead, scanning the surface, the sensors recorded a strange anomaly, a cluster of heat signatures forming geometric patterns too complex to be accidental. What they saw was not chaos, but civilization, blooming where fire was forbidden. And at its center stood a human, his hands stained with clay, his eyes reflecting the light of two suns, quietly building the impossible. The storm that had spared the camp once did not grant mercy a second time. It returned with fury, wider, darker, and filled with an energy that seemed alive. For 2 full rotations of Serene 4's twin suns, a wall of dust lingered on the horizon, devouring light and sound alike. Every creature on the planet felt the coming violence in its bones. The air grew heavier, and the dunes began to vibrate faintly beneath the surface, as if the planet itself trembled in anticipation. Elias stood at the edge of the ridge and watched the sky split open, his expression unreadable. The others hid inside their shelters, whispering about whether the ovens would hold, whether the camp could survive another beating from the planet. But he knew this was no ordinary storm. The temperature drop, the static charge in the air, and the red shimmer across the sand all pointed to something rare, an electrostatic maelstrom, a fusion of heat, dust, and magnetized particles. It would scour everything exposed. He moved quickly, calling the cadets out one by one. His voice, calm but commanding, cut through the wind. "Cover the reflectors with clay sheets," he shouted. "Bury the smaller ovens. Pack the gaps with wet sand. If it breathes, it stands." His instructions carried precision born of experience. He worked alongside them, sealing vents and reinforcing structures until his hands bled. The sky dimmed into copper shadows, and a strange hum filled the air, a low resonance that set every bone trembling. When the first gust struck, it came not as wind, but as impact, like the fist of a giant. The air roared, and the world turned to dust. Sand blasted through every gap. The cadets huddled inside their clay shelters, sealing doors with damp cloths and crouching low. The heat outside fell away, replaced by an icy chill that seeped through the ground. Elias crouched inside his oven shelter, his back pressed to the curved wall. The vibrations of the storm pulsed through the clay, alive and thunderous. He could hear the Nathari crying out in the distance, her fragile bones shuddering with every strike. He forced himself to stay still. Movement meant weakness now. The walls had to hold on their own. Minutes stretched into hours. The The storm screamed, clawing at every surface. Then, as if to test the limits of endurance, lightning began to fall, not in bolts, but in glowing arcs that danced across the dunes. Each flash illuminated the camp in fragments, domes half buried, reflective plates melting, alien faces pressed against walls, eyes wide with terror. Inside his shelter, Elias pressed his palms against the floor and felt something remarkable. The earth beneath was still warm. The ovens, built deep enough and layered thick with clay, retained the heat they had absorbed during the day. The storm above was a force of destruction, but below, the trapped warmth was life. He realized that if the surface collapsed, the warmth could become their salvation. He crawled toward the small vent he had left at the base of his shelter and peered outside. The world was gone, nothing but orange dust and flickering light. Yet in that chaos he saw something important. The dunes were shifting in a pattern. The sand was not simply being moved, it was being sculpted by the wind into deep furrows, trenches that ran like rivers. When the storm finally began to weaken, Elias emerged. His face was streaked with dust, his lips cracked, but his eyes burned with resolve. The camp was half buried, yet still intact. The ovens stood like ancient relics poking through the dunes. He climbed onto one of them and scanned the horizon. The air still shimmered with charged particles, but the worst had passed. He motioned for the others to come out. One by one, the cadets crawled from the sand, dazed but alive. Some fell to their knees in exhaustion. Others stared in awe at the sight of their camp still standing when it should have been erased. Saren slithered toward him, her scales dull and cracked from the sand's abrasion. "You knew it would hold," she said, her voice raspy. Elias shook his head slowly. "No one knows what holds," he replied. "We only build for the chance that it might." He turned back to the ovens, kneeling beside the largest one where a thin trail of smoke leaked through a vent. He opened it carefully, and to his astonishment, the food inside was warm, perfectly cooked by the stored heat and pressure of the storm. He laughed, a dry, disbelieving sound that echoed across the dunes. The others gathered around as he handed out pieces of baked grain and softened roots. It was a small victory, but in that moment, it felt sacred. As the second sun set, the aftermath revealed the full scale of destruction. The reflective frames were shattered. The upper layers of clay were fused into glass from lightning strikes. The dunes had shifted so much that the camp's orientation was entirely new. Yet among the wreckage, something else had emerged, a new landscape of trenches and hollows that trapped moisture from the storm's static discharges. Elias walked into one of these furrows and found, to his surprise, that the sand there was damp. The storm, though violent, had left behind water in the form of condensed vapor trapped beneath the surface. It was a rare miracle on Serene 4, and he knew instantly what it meant. Survival was no longer temporary. This was sustainability. Over the next days, he led the cadets in reshaping the camp. They redirected trenches to collect more condensation. He designed underground channels lined with clay that guided the moisture toward storage pits. The Irex dug tirelessly, their claws perfect for tunneling. The Nathari gathered shattered crystal shards and embedded them in the clay to act as natural coolants. The Alari, though weakened, used fragments of their bodies to reflect light away from the most fragile structures. The camp evolved not through technology, but through understanding. Elias called it the Earth's breath, the idea that the planet itself exhaled life for those who listened to its rhythm. At night, when the air cooled and silence returned, Elias sat alone by the half-ruined reflector, polishing its fractured surface. His hands moved slowly, methodically, as if performing a ritual. Saren approached him again, carrying a bowl of warm stew from the newly dug ovens. She set it beside him without speaking, then sat down on the sand. "The storm could have killed us all," she said quietly. "Yet it gave us water. How do you make sense of that?" Elias smiled faintly, not looking up. "You don't make sense of it. You learn from it. Nature doesn't care about fairness, only balance. It takes and gives in the same motion." She watched him for a long moment, then whispered, "You speak as though the planet listens to you." He finally looked up, his gaze steady. "It doesn't listen," he said. "It teaches. I just pay attention." By the 5th day after the storm, the camp looked entirely different. The ovens were reinforced with thicker layers of clay and buried deeper underground. The The condensation channels ran like veins through the sand, connecting storage pits filled with cool, filtered water. The air around the camp felt less hostile, almost welcoming. The cadets moved with confidence again, no longer fearing the planet's wrath. Elias walked among them, his posture straight, but his eyes thoughtful. He knew the storm had changed more than the landscape. It had changed him. He had come to prove human adaptability, but he had discovered something far greater: harmony, born from struggle. One evening, as the suns dipped below the horizon, the instructor's satellite passed overhead again. From orbit, the camp glowed faintly, a geometric pattern of heat signatures, more organized and radiant than before. The report that followed described unprecedented structural evolution and thermal utilization beyond expected parameters. But for Elias, those words meant nothing. What mattered was what he could see and feel: the warmth of the ovens beneath his hands, the sound of laughter drifting through the air, and the realization that survival on Serene 4 was no longer a fight. It was a collaboration. He stood on the ridge as night fell, watching the twin moons rise over the dunes. The storm had carved deep scars across the land, but within those scars, life had found a way to root itself. The air smelled faintly of wet clay and baked grain, and for the first time since the exam began, the desert looked beautiful. Elias closed his eyes and whispered to the wind, not as a prayer, but as gratitude. The storm had tried to bury them, but instead, it had revealed the truth he had always believed, that the greatest fire a human could carry was not born of flame, but of resilience. When the suns rose again, Serene 4 no longer looked like the same world. The dunes that had once stretched endlessly in monotony were now patterned with ridges and shallow basins, many glistening faintly with the moisture trapped beneath the sand. The wind had calmed, the heat had steadied, and the air carried the scent of earth that had been transformed by human hands. The cadets no longer woke in panic or despair. They rose with quiet purpose, each knowing his or her role in the rhythm of their survival. The ovens burned with invisible fire, the condensation pits shimmered with fresh water, and the sun kitchen radiated steady warmth. It was no longer a camp. It was a settlement born from resilience. Elias walked through it slowly that morning, his steps leaving light prints in the sand. His arms still bore scars from the lightning storm, his skin marked by burns that healed unevenly, but he carried himself with calm dignity. He greeted the cadets as he passed, exchanging nods and small gestures. The Irex raised a claw in silent respect. The Nathari offered him a handful of roasted seeds as breakfast. Saren slithered beside him for a while, her movements graceful and unhurried. "You look like a man who's already home," she said softly. He smiled. "Maybe home isn't a place," he replied. "Maybe it's the moment when the struggle finally makes sense." The Galactic Academy's transmission arrived without warning. A faint pulse echoed through the sand, a coded signal that the exam period had ended. The message came through the emergency beacon the cadets had repaired weeks earlier using scraps from the old transport. Elias gathered everyone near the sun kitchen, where the light fell perfectly on the clay surface. A holographic projection flickered to life, showing the image of an instructor, a stern figure with pale skin and metallic eyes, speaking in the clipped tone of authority. "Cadets of Serene 4, the voice announced. "Your examination is complete. Extraction teams are en route. Prepare for retrieval in 24 hours. The words hung in the air like a final bell, marking the end of a long and punishing journey. Yet instead of celebration, silence fell across the group. No one moved. The Irex clicked his mandibles uncertainly. The Nathari shifted her wings. Even Saren looked uneasy. The camp, once their prison, had become something sacred, something earned. Leaving it behind felt like tearing away a part of themselves. Elias was the first to speak. "We'll prepare," he said simply, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew they couldn't stay. The rules were clear, but part of him resisted the idea of abandoning everything they had built. The ovens, the channels, the water pits. All of it represented more than survival. It was proof that intelligence was not limited by technology, that cooperation could replace fear, and that the human spark of creativity could thrive even when stripped to its core. He spent the day organizing the camp, not for departure, but for remembrance. He instructed the cadets to reinforce the ovens one last time, to fill the water channels to their brim, and to leave portions of dried food sealed in clay for the next explorers who might come. "Every place deserves a legacy," he said quietly. "Even this one." As evening approached, the camp gathered for one final meal under the twin suns. The light turned golden, painting everything in shades of amber and bronze. The ovens glowed faintly, the air humming with warmth. Elias stood beside the large central structure, the first clay dome he had ever built, and broke a loaf of sun-baked bread in half. He handed one piece to Saren, who accepted it with both hands. Around them, the cadets began to eat in silence, each lost in his or her own thoughts. Some wept quietly. Others stared at the horizon, where the first stars began to pierce through the dimming light. For the first time, no one spoke of hardship or fear. There was only gratitude. When darkness settled, Elias climbed the ridge that overlooked the camp. The wind was gentle now, carrying a coolness that hinted at stability. From that height, the ovens formed a pattern, a spiral radiating from the sun kitchen's heart, shaped unintentionally through weeks of construction and adaptation. It resembled a symbol, ancient and deliberate, the mark of intelligent life claiming harmony with nature instead of dominance over it. He felt something shift within him, a quiet realization that this was what humanity's role in the galaxy truly was. Not conqueror, not ruler, but teacher. Humanity did not outlast others by strength. It endured by understanding. At dawn, the extraction vessel appeared in the sky. It descended slowly, a sleek metallic silhouette against the burning horizon. The hum of its engines disrupted the peaceful silence, reminding everyone that the exam's end was also a departure. Elias watched as the cadets packed their few belongings, glancing one last time at the ovens and shelters they had built. When the ramp lowered, he turned to face the others. "What we built here doesn't die when we leave," he said. "The sun will still rise, the clay will still hold heat, and the planet will remember what we taught it." The Thalri lowered her head respectfully. The Elari's crystalline skin glimmered faintly as he replied, "It is we who learned human. You showed us how to speak with the world instead of shouting at it." Elias smiled but said nothing more. He simply looked once more at the dunes, memorizing every curve, every shadow, before stepping onto the ramp. Inside the ship, the cadets sat in silence as the engines lifted them from the ground. Through the viewing window, Serene 4 spread out below, its golden plains streaked with the faint spiral of their camp, still glowing faintly in the early light. The oven's heat signatures shimmered against the cold sand like a constellation on the surface. Saren leaned toward Elias. "Do you think anyone else will ever find it?" she asked. He watched the planet grow smaller beneath them and answered, "Maybe not soon, but someday someone will land there, find what we left, and understand what it means to build warmth without fire. That will be enough." When they returned to the academy, the debriefing took hours. The instructors asked questions about structure, adaptation, resource management, and survival philosophy. Elias answered patiently, explaining the balance between heat and material, the storage of energy, and the psychological shift from desperation to creation. But when the head examiner asked him what the greatest lesson of Serene 4 was, he hesitated. Then he said, "The lesson wasn't about survival, it was about perception. We came believing that fire meant life, and that its absence meant death. But fire was never the point. It was understanding transformation. Heat doesn't come from flame. It comes from persistence, from the willingness to shape what exists into something new. That's what kept us alive." The examiner regarded him in silence before nodding slowly. "Human adaptability continues to surprise us," he said. "Your name will be entered into the Academy's archive under the designation Serene Method. Future classes will study your techniques." Months later, when Elias walked alone across the Academy's central courtyard, he looked up at the night sky. The stars shimmered with familiar patterns, but one in particular drew his gaze, the faint, red glimmer of Serene 4. He wondered if the ovens were still standing, if the spiral in the sand still caught the morning light. He liked to imagine that the wind carried traces of their work across the dunes, that some small creature had found warmth beside a vent, that the world had absorbed the memory of their time there. He closed his eyes and smiled. He could still feel the heat of the clay beneath his hands, still smell the faint aroma of baked grain, still hear the laughter of the cadets as they discovered that survival could be beautiful. He realized then that the exam had never truly ended. Every world that humanity touched was another serene, waiting for a spark that did not burn, but illuminated. Elias walked on, the sound of his boots echoing softly in the quiet courtyard. The academy's lights glowed pale and artificial, but in his mind he could see the real light, the twin suns of Serene 4, fierce and forgiving, rising once more over a camp made of clay, sand, and human will. He whispered under his breath, almost as if speaking to the planet itself. Fire isn't flame, it's transformation. And with that, he kept walking, carrying the warmth of Serene 4, not as memory, but as proof that in the coldest reaches of the universe, where rules forbade fire, humanity would always find a way to make the sun burn within.